but the internet wasn't cooperating with me this morning, so you're going to have to use your imaginations a little bit. So it's a slide of Zion National Park. I was out there about 10 years ago with my wife, and we were hiking up in Zion. It's out in Utah. And it was a really important place to hike for my wife, because when her family went when she was young, she was 10 years old, the children were forbidden to go on the hike up to Angel's Landing. And so she was bound and determined to do Angel's Landing this time. And so for those of you that have never been there, and I hadn't, and I didn't know what's Angel's Landing, right? It sounds like a heliport for angels. But basically, it's this hill that you go back and forth, you know, the back and forth of tall mountains for about 2 hours, and you get up to a point where you're kind of on it's kind of a steep but nice climb, and then all of a sudden you get to this point where the trail narrows significantly to the point where only one person can be on the trail at a time, and they've put this chain into the side of the hill to hang on to, because on either side it's this sheer drop off for hundreds of feet. And so you have to go on this little thing before you get up to this landing that's just this nice plateau, and that's what they call Angel's Landing. And it's very famous in Zion National Park. So I was following, and probably something you don't know about me, I'm deathly afraid of heights. And so I'm like, okay, I'll do it. It's for her. This is really important to her. You know, I'm going to be a good spouse here. And so we go about 10 feet on that part with the chain, and I go, honey, I can't do this, because you're either going to have to call a helicopter or an angel to get me back down. I can get up because I can look up, but coming back down you have to look where your feet are going, and I would absolutely freeze. So what I did is backed down to where the last plateau was, and there's this big pine tree there. And so she went on ahead and spent like an hour and a half, 2 hours up there, and I went under this pine tree, and I took a nap, and I ate my lunch, and then I do what ministers do, which is think deep thoughts. And so what you're going to get today is the result of those deep thoughts that I was thinking about at the time. So at the time, I was taking a seminary class, and we were debating the topic, are we climbing the same mountain? And the source of our discussion was an excerpt from a book by a well-known religion professor and author, Stephen Prothero, and it was titled, God is Not One: The 8 Rival Religions That Run the World and Why Their Differences Matter. And our discussion started by considering all the points of view of religion throughout history and representing them visually as a climb up that big mountain of truth with a capital T. And each felt they had found the highest mountain and the correct path to truth. So then we started talking about the modern, as in 20th century modern, concept of all religions really being one when you boil down to their essence. And I quote from the opening essay from which Prothero summarizes the thoughts of Gandhi and the Dalai Lama and others. This is the quote: "What the world's religions share is not so much God as the good, the sweet harmony of peace, love, and understanding," end quote. But then I would add to that, hope. I think this has been very much the normative thought within Unitarianism and Universalism throughout much of the 20th century. This could be described, frankly, if you think of my mountain metaphor, as alternate paths up the mountain to get to the common truth. But then Prothero goes on to argue that by claiming that all religions point to the same truth, it dismisses the nuances and depth of understanding from each. We may have a tendency to dismiss them as completely not worthy of our effort to really understand if we don't value their distinctiveness. So then our class started talking about sort of a postmodern metaphor that works for me, and it was something like Zion National Park. The mountains in Zion are very old, and they weren't actually volcanic, so they didn't grow out of this, thrusting up into the air. It was actually part of erosion over long, long periods of time, so that the tops of all the hills are all plateaus rather than peaks. And I like to think of each of our sources represented by mountains in this park. And in order to limit the appearance of any one source being truth with a capital T, I prefer the flat tops. To me, it gives a sense of equality rather than superiority. Oh, and by the way, if you're going to go with me on this trip with my metaphor, it doesn't include volcanoes. I can't have one mountain erupting and taking over everything else. So just stick with me on that one. So what we do then is we wander up these mountainsides, and we may never reach the top. That's not so important. The point is to discover the meaning of the mountain, which may or may not lead to a higher understanding of ultimate meaning. This isn't one of those adventure races I've heard about where somebody tries to climb all the 7 highest mountains on the earth, one from each continent, in 1 year. In fact, you may sit on the mountain where you feel most comfortable. And you might even look across the valley to the mountain in the next valley and consider it from where you're sitting. This is what I feel like we do in our congregations today. Most of our congregations, particularly in this part of the country, were founded with a strong religious humanist tradition. So we tend to sit on that humanist mountain. We look over at the Buddhist mountain, or the Jewish mountain, or the mystic mountain, or the pagan mountain, or the prophetic men and women mountain, if you go back to the sources I read. And then we say that they're important to us, and we claim them as sources, but we only give them occasional lip service as references in our worship services, like I've been doing today. You'll see it scattered throughout the whole service. So allow me then to take this metaphor a little bit further. I think the parkland around the base of the mountains represents our lives in society. The mountains exist in society and are part of it, but their special characteristic, frankly their height, suggests the possibility of transcendence. I think the role of our congregations is to function as the outfitter in the park. Our role is to outfit the congregants for their trips to the mountain and encourage as many trips as possible. The congregational leadership can think of themselves as trip planners. Now, every congregation should have at least one spiritual leader, and often that's the role of the minister, but it doesn't have to be. Well, last summer then, I took another course on world religion by the same professor. This time we considered the purpose of each religious tradition. So earlier I mentioned that we should walk on the paths alongside of the mountain and contemplate its meaning. In this class, we started with the premise that human beings have religion to bring us hope. And it basically works like this. There's something that is, we think about what something is today, how we experience something as it is today. And then we think about what we believe something should be, sort of an utopian vision of something. And then you join that together by a unique metaphor, and you kind of have a religion. It's the way the metaphor is constructed, and the stories told about it that give the followers hope. Hope that there's a clear path towards that's what something should be. In other words, if one has a specific worldview or orientation to the universe, and one accepts the metaphor, then one becomes a believer. The believer then finds hope in the message as the faith tradition is incorporated within all aspects of their life. And this is frankly the essence of the title of my sermon today, The Universality of Hope. So I'm going to try this on with you, and I'm going to go through 7 of the most influential faith traditions. Now, I'm going to put air quotes around most influential because I kind of picked and chose a little bit. And the first one's going to surprise you because the first one is Yoruba. And most people are like, what is Yoruba? Well, Yoruba is the dominant traditional religion of Western Africa. And there's millions of people that live in Western Africa, so purely by the numbers, it's an important religion on the planet. But in the Western Hemisphere, it's important because of the 400 years of slave trade, 400 to 600 years of slave trade that came over to North and South America. And so it's greatly influenced African American tradition, the slave tradition originally. Today, probably the best thing you could think of is in Haiti, and a lot of the voodoo and those kinds of religion kind of most directly stem from Yoruba. So in Yoruba, the assumption is that destiny is chosen before we're born. And the problem is we're separated from that destiny because of ignorance. We don't know what we're supposed to do with our lives. And in their tradition, the solution is divination. as techniques used by the priests to make that connection and help you understand what your destiny should be. The next one is Hinduism. The problem with Hinduism, it's set up as I'm wandering in this vicious cycle of life, death, and rebirth. It kind of sort of is going nowhere. And then the solution, of course, is to escape the cycle, and it's part of the karma, the moral law of the universe. And the goal is really to eliminate the idea that we're separate from God. The goal is enlightenment and harmony with God, the divine. Buddhism. The problem here is suffering or dissatisfaction. Dissatisfaction within the suffering of the world, but also dissatisfaction with finding the right path. The solution is an acceptance in the impermanence of everything. All things are void of an essential nature. It brings philosophical enlightenment and existential freedom. And the hope, then, is that we can give up that which causes suffering. Judaism. The assumption in Judaism, even though it's not followed by a large group of people, it obviously has had a very important role in religious history, so therefore it's up on the list. The assumption is it's a myth of history, a sense of movement in time with religious significance. Jews were called into a covenant with God to show the world how to live properly and to save the world. And so the solution there is be in right relationship with God as portrayed in the historical stories. And the hope is that it can be done and God will bless the world accordingly. The world will be saved through righteous action. Islam. The problem in Islam is how should one live one's life to be in right relations with God, particularly in these modern times? And the solution is Muhammad. Muhammad is the ideal model for Muslim life. He's called, and this is a quote, the living Quran, the embodiment in this behavior and words of God's will. I'm going to quote right from the book we were reading. Muhammad is not only the ideal political leader, statesman, merchant, judge, soldier, and diplomat, but also the ideal husband, father, and friend. And so therefore, following the laws of God are paramount on a path to piety, as Muhammad would have done. Christianity. The problem is a universal law that humans are born evil and sinful, and it's human nature. What can be done? The solution is to believe that God redeemed creation by suffering for this flaw, the theology of atonement. And through this belief, we can become whole and better, personally and as a society. Through belief in God as an agent in history and being humble before God, one can move past one's sinful nature and find hope. And then I threw religious humanism in it, because it's not maybe important on the world stage, but it certainly is important to Unitarian Universalists. The problem is, how does one find hope in a modern world that relies on critical thinking, logic, and the scientific method? The, quote, death of God eliminated the hope of supernatural guidance for the purpose that humans had relied on for millennia. Can we find hope if humans are just left to themselves? Well, the solution is threefold. Belief in the inherent goodness of humans, and therefore the inherent worth and dignity of everyone. Belief in our own agency, the ability of humans to solve our own problems. And third, the belief in the evolvement of our species to one that can live in harmony with each other and the finite world upon which we find ourselves. We find hope in coming together to affirm these ideas and to support each other to build a better world. Okay, so there you have 7 world religions, and summing it up, we just went around the world in like 10 minutes. So religious humanism, as I said, dominates Unitarian Universalist thinking, but yet we lift up these 6 sources that I read about, so that means we're not just supposed to be religious humanists either. So how can we lean into these sources of hope? So I'm going to give you my personal examples of how I do it, And I would encourage you to think about these because they are our 6 sources for a reason. And I think a lot of people feel uncomfortable with some of them. And those are probably the ones you should probably pay the most attention to and lean into and help yourself. So, Yoruba and other nature-based religions, I took the liberty of kind of lumping it all together. Personally, I find great comfort in considering the vastness of the universe and history. It makes my problems seem so less significant and gives me confidence that others have faced similar things and found answers. You know, I find myself surrounded by physical items from my ancestors. If you were to come to my house, it looks like an eclectic garage sale. And because of that, I'm surrounded by things from my grandparents, my great-grandparents, my aunt, people like that, my parents, who, by the way, are all deceased. I'm the oldest member of my family. I often think about them and how they would view the world, the life I'm living. In fact, I feel my mother and my aunt's presence at my concerts, and I talked in my joy that I had 3 concerts this weekend, because they were big singers and choirs. Sometimes I feel it with so much intensity, I start crying in the middle of a concert, which is really a problem because people have come to pay to hear me sing and I'm standing there crying, so I have to kind of get over it. But I really do believe that they're there. Now, I don't believe in predestination, but I do believe that we all have a destiny in our lives, and we spend our whole lifetime figuring out what that destiny might be and determining if we are really all that we can be in this one short, precious life we're given. So, in my opinion, if consulting with my ancestors or mentally tapping into the energy of nature calms me and helps me think and feel more clearly, so be it. This brings me hope. Hinduism. At first, when I first think about Hinduism, I think of it being very existential, kind of nihilistic, kind of stuck in a rut, no way out kind of thinking. But it's not too hard to get my head wrapped around the concept of karma. What we do in this life will come back manifold. If we're negative and cause harm, negativity and harm will come back to us. If we're positive and spread love and goodwill, it will come back to us. Sort of a common sense religion, reap what you sow. But Hinduism is very, very rich in metaphor, and it's very culturally specific. And some have even questioned whether Hinduism is more of a culture than a religion, because we think of it in terms of a Western lens. It's a religion in which you can create your own personal God. You can find your own path, find your own meaning. And when you think about it like that, that sounds an awful lot like Unitarian Universalism all of a sudden. Yoga, as we were talking about before during the children's story, it's the clearest manifestation in this country of Hindi practices. A physical way to become grounded in the goodness of the world and the goodness in our own hearts. In fact, my yoga instructor often thanks us for sharing our practice with them. I think it was last weekend, she closed with 3 ohms. And I was kind of laughing to myself because I wondered how many of the fundamentalist Christians in the room knew that that was actually a prayer to Brahman that we were doing. But I just let you know we went with it. But I always leave yoga feeling more hopeful than when I arrived. Buddhism. Buddhism is very popular among Unitarian Universalists because belief in a deity is not part of the theology, although many scholars would argue that the Buddha has been elevated to that role in many cases. Unitarian Universalists tend to be very heady people. We seem to like to think our way through it. Buddhist meditation practices emptying the mind, being very, very present to the moment. Unitarian Universalists also tend to approach suffering as a problem to be solved, very scientific. Buddhism asks us to consider the nature of the problem. Is it our attachment to impermanence that causes our suffering? Its practices are a nice counterbalance to Unitarian Universalist tendencies, I think. Judaism. Judaism's a little bit harder for me to get my head wrapped around because the faith is so closely connected to a specific ethnic and cultural group. However, We share the idea of being an example to the world, a new and better way of being religious. So I'm not sure if everybody in the room understands this, but our religious ancestry dates back to the Pilgrims. They came over from England. They were Congregationalists, which meant they had a very democratic way of doing religion, and it was counter to the Church of England at the time. That's kind of why they didn't feel like they could stay in England. And when they arrived in Massachusetts, there was a lot of talk about being that golden city on the hill, Boston. They were going to create this shining example of how to do religion. And Congregationalism was to be the evolvement of Christianity and was to be the shining example of how to be with God. Many stories in Judaism, like the story of Hanukkah and the Maccabean revolt that we're going to sing about in a few minutes for our closing hymn, also lend themselves to our focus on social justice. Fight for freedom and justice, and be an example to the world. For me, our popular reference to the moral arc of the universe ultimately bending towards justice fits in here. Our purpose as Unitarian Universalists is to nudge that arc as much as possible towards ultimate justice. And we find hope in this justice-seeking metaphor. Islam. I think Islam is the faith Unitarian Universalists struggle with the most, but I think that has more to do with the cultural schism between Islam and the Christian West than anything else. Frankly, it was inevitable that Christianity and Islam would conflict with each other because they are the two religions of empire that needed to convert other people. There's the belief that each has found the true path and that all other faiths are false. And at their roots, these faiths have developed over time. There really isn't room for the other. However, Unitarian Universalists tap into Islam through the door of mystical Sufism. Rumi, which, I'm sure you've used it here, come, come, whoever you are, wanderer, worshiper, not lover of leaving, that entry, gathering song, is a poem by Rumi. And he came from a tradition seeking a oneness with the divine in a very emotional, experiential, and spiritual level. The whirling dervishes are the most famous example of Sufism. And this is an area of opportunity for Unitarian Universalists. How can we become so emotionally attached to our spiritual journeys that we have feelings of spiritual ecstasy? The other area to explore in Islam is ritual and discipline. Muslims are known for their adherence to discipline, stopping their busy lives to pray and honor the divine 5 times a day. And in Ramadan, it's a discipline of sacrifice for a whole month. Okay, really? I think most of us would rationalize our way out of this kind of devotional intensity. But should we? We may find intense feelings of hope by living a highly disciplined life of sacrifice and devotion to something greater than ourselves. Christianity. Many of us struggle with Christianity because the form that is so dominant in the culture today can be so counter to our fundamental beliefs. Now here I'm talking about the inherent goodness and worth of everyone, juxtaposed to a theology that I grew up with that said we are by nature sinful and unclean. I remember my mother saying those words in confessional when I was a little kid, and I couldn't figure out how my mother was sinful and unclean. Well, Unitarianism and Universalism both have Christianity as the dominant theology in our religious ancestry. But the Christian theology we tap into is very different from what dominates today. At Unitarianism's root is the rejection of the divinity of Christ. And at Universalism's root is the rejection of the concept of limited salvation. Salvation is open to everyone. We've always approached Jesus more the way Islam approaches Muhammad, a prophet, a perfect human, a teacher, a divinely inspired, unique individual worthy of our adoration and worship. And I'm using the term worship there in the sense of to lift up, to set apart. So that's one reason I read for you the hymn, It Came Upon a Midnight Clear. It's about living the truly radical, accepting, and loving life portrayed in the stories of Jesus. not the legalistic and righteous exclusivity that is expressed so often today. We can find and embrace the hope in this Christian message. So, our list of 6 sources, along with our 7 principles, are a reason I do believe we continue to offer a relevant message of hope to the world. We acknowledge the vast complexity of human culture and stress the journey on the mountain, not the need to reach the top and plant our flag of truth with a capital T at the pinnacle above all others. Unitarian Universalists should embrace the inner faith we have built right into our theology. Inner faith is about experiencing the other, about considering a different point of reference, about the problem each tradition is trying to solve to create hope. We need to hike the mountain as a pilgrim, as an explorer, not as a scientist. Only then can we find hope in our own religious universalism. And my wish is that together we will open our hearts and spirits, not just our minds, to the hope contained in the richness of religious metaphor, regardless of our comfort with the cultural context it's grounded in. May it be so, and may we always be richer for it. Amen. And I realize that we have gone over. So I think what we're going to do is go right into the closing hymn, and I will be around, and I would welcome lots of conversation about this after the service.